Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column is written by Mr. Rajiv Bhatia, a former Indian diplomat, and through this article, he goes on to evaluate the evolving strategy of the United States towards the Indo Pacific region. See, today, the Indo Pacific region has emerged as the global hub of geopolitics. This region, sandwiched between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, has become the central focal point of the global economy and as well as for global geopolitics. So, naturally, the attention of the world's topmost power, that is the United States, has shifted towards the Indo Pacific. Earlier, during the Cold War era, when the US was locked in a Cold War conflict with the Soviet Union, American diplomacy and American military strategy was largely focused on Europe and the Atlantic Ocean. From the 1950s to 1990s, that is till the collapse of the Soviet Union, American geopolitics was centered around this region. Then, following the 9/11 attacks, the United States launched its so called global war on terrorism, which would go on to drag the United States into several conflicts across Asia and Africa, stretching for more than 2 decades. This led to US military involvement in countries such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Syria, etc. So, over the last 2 decades, American diplomacy and American military have been excessively focused over these conflict zones in Asia and Africa. As the American war on terrorism was ongoing, and as the United States continued its military engagement in some of these conflicts, it started facing a new geopolitical challenge, which was posed by an emergent China, particularly from 2010 onwards. As China's economic and military capabilities grew rapidly through the 1990s, we started witnessing the positioning of China as a major global power by early 2000s. By 2010, China had clearly emerged as a global power and it was exerting its influence across the Indo Pacific, which had become the global hub of geopolitics and the global economy. As China became more assertive and aggressive in its foreign policy and in its military strategy, it started displaying territorial ambitions, thereby raising maritime claims in the South China Sea, thus leading to several maritime disputes with multiple countries in Southeast Asia. Along with stepping up these maritime disputes in the South China Sea, China also started aggressively exerting its influence and presence across the Indian Ocean region and as well as across South Asia, Central Asia, and the Pacific region. So, this sudden and aggressive rise of China was immediately countered by the United States from 2010 itself, when the then President Obama launched the Pivot to Asia policy of the United States. The Pivot to Asia policy of the US was designed to realign American presence, that is, both its diplomatic and military presence, from the Atlantic towards the Indo Pacific region, where it was looking to counter the aggressive and emergent China. So, as the United States waded itself into the South China Sea disputes, and as it started aligning with like minded countries in the region who were opposed to China, geopolitical tensions naturally started to grow between US and China. Over the last few years, these tensions have really heated up, and several strategic experts are even referring to this rivalry as a Cold War 2.0. So, now with a new administration in place in the United States, President Joe Biden has started taking several steps to fine tune the Indo Pacific strategy of the US, which is primarily focused on containing China and countering Chinese aggression in the region. As a part of this policy, recently President Biden sent out 3 of his top officials into the region, even as the world is battling deadly waves of the pandemic. These high profile visits of US officials to countries in the Indo Pacific region comes at a time when US China tensions are at an all time high, which is clearly witnessed in their economic rivalry, diplomatic rivalry, and military rivalry. So, to make better sense of the American strategy in the Indo Pacific, the writer evaluates the recent visits by high profile American officials to the Indo Pacific region. First, he focuses on the visit of Wendy Sherman, the Deputy Secretary of State, which is the equivalent of a Deputy Foreign Minister, to four important countries in the Indo Pacific. On the directions of President Biden, Wendy Sherman paid a visit to Japan, South Korea, Mongolia, and of course to China. Out of these four countries, two of them are the closest allies of the United States, that is, Japan and South Korea. During this visit, Wendy Sherman highlighted the American priority of promoting peace and prosperity in the region by calling upon the countries of the region to strictly abide by a rules based international order. This is a reference by the United States to China's refusal to obey international laws in the South China Sea with regard to the ongoing maritime disputes. Maritime disputes and maritime boundaries are regulated as per the UN clause or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which China has repeatedly violated and refused to abide by. So, countries led by the United States have always called for a strict implementation of rules based order in the Indo Pacific region, where every country is mandated to follow and abide by the international laws. During her visit to Japan and South Korea, the United States has highlighted the close strategic relations that the US shares with these countries, and it was followed by an American attempt to resolve the new tensions that have emerged between Japan and South Korea. Even though these two East Asian countries are close allies of each other, and even though they are like minded countries, fresh tensions have emerged between them in the trade and political domain. So the United States has been playing a role to resolve these tensions by mediating the disputes between Japan and South Korea. During this visit, the United States has also focused on the ongoing situation in Myanmar, as Japan is also equally interested in ensuring stability in the country. So, apart from strengthening ties with Japan and South Korea, Wendy Sherman also paid a visit to Mongolia, which is an immediate neighbor of China and shares a close relationship with China. But in the recent years, Mongolia has been trying to assert its independence, and it has been seeking to balance its relations with China by developing closer relations with US and as well as with India. In this context, the US has brought back its focus on Mongolia as well, and this is a part of the American strategy to strengthen ties with like-minded countries and allies that are located in the immediate neighborhood of China. But while visiting China, Wendy Sherman has conveyed to the Chinese leadership that the United States does not seek confrontation with China. But however, she did bring up the human rights situation in Xinjiang, which is a topic on which China strongly refuses to have discussions on. But apart from that, during this visit, US and China did exchange notes about areas of competition and cooperation, and they even held discussions about a possible meet between President Biden and Premier Xi Jinping, along with preparations for the upcoming G20 summit in Italy. So, this visit of Wendy Sherman to the Indo Pacific region was quite interesting because during this visit, the United States was not openly seeking confrontation with China. Instead, it was putting up a tough posture by strengthening its alliances with Japan and South Korea and by reaching out to Mongolia. But at the same time, it was indicating to China that the US is always ready for a dialogue on any conflicting issue. In contrast to this visit, the visit by another top American official, that is Mr. Lloyd Austin, who is the current Secretary of Defense, presented a more aggressive picture of the United States in the Indo Pacific. As a part of this visit, the Secretary of Defense paid a visit to three important ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia. This visit covered Singapore, Vietnam, and Philippines, and all three countries have very close strategic relations with the United States. During this visit, the Secretary of Defense was quite aggressive about American military presence in the region and repeatedly stressed the importance of maintaining a strong military presence to deter any threats in the South China Sea. The Secretary of Defense openly rejected China's maritime claims in the South China Sea and openly advocated that the US would not hesitate to use both military and non-military options in order to contain the threats and challenges being created by China in the Indo-Pacific. He was strongly critical of China's aggressive behavior against its neighbors and even specifically mentioned China's recent aggression against India. During this visit, the US Secretary of Defense sought to strengthen American ties with Singapore, Vietnam, and Philippines. And with all the three countries, the US already has a very close military relationship. During this visit, Singapore reiterated its logistical support to American military aircrafts and vessels near the strategic Strait of Malacca, and in return, Singapore enjoys the benefits of training its armed forces, particularly its air force, at American military bases in the Pacific Ocean. Then, with Vietnam, Lloyd Austin urged for closer defense cooperation between the two countries, as Vietnam is one of the primary countries which has been affected by Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. Then Philippines, which is also equally affected by Chinese aggression, has agreed to fully restore the Visiting Forces Agreement with the US, which provides the legal basis for continued American military presence in Philippines. Then the third visit came from Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, to South Asia and Middle East. He paid an important visit to India and as well as to Kuwait to reiterate the convergence of interests between the United States and these key Asian powers. During Blinken's visit to India, he interacted with the top leadership, including the Prime Minister, the National Security Advisor, and the External Affairs Minister. And he not only appreciated India's independent foreign policy and its strategic autonomy in the foreign policy domain, but he also highlighted the convergence of interests between the two nations. Even though India doesn't see itself as an ally of the United States, India definitely sees itself as a close partner of the United States. The United States acknowledges these priorities of India and has highlighted that the two countries share one of the closest partnerships in the region. So Antony Blinken has highlighted the importance of groupings such as quadrilateral, which includes India, US, Japan, and Australia, as such a grouping of like-minded countries can help in establishing rules-based order in the Indo Pacific. But at the same time, he has acknowledged India's independent foreign policy, where India doesn't like to be seen as an ally of any country, and the United States has understood India's reluctance to enter into any military clubs or military groupings. In line with this understanding, Antony Blinken stressed that quadrilateral is not a military alliance, but instead it's a grouping of like-minded countries in the Indo Pacific, which are just looking to uphold a rules-based order. So while Wendy Sherman adopted a tough but moderate approach during her visit to these countries in the Indo Pacific, Lloyd Austin displayed more military aggression, whereas Antony Blinken sought to build partnerships with like-minded countries. And this, according to the writer, is a part of a collective strategy of President Biden to put in place an updated version of its Indo Pacific doctrine that is designed to counter China and contain China. So, in combination, these three visits represent the evolution of American policy towards China, which is a mix of hostility, competition, and cooperation. So, as far as its bilateral ties with China is concerned, the US is trying to adopt a tough posture to stand up to Chinese aggression, but at the same time, it is trying to keep the doors open for any dialogue and negotiations. While US and China are openly hostile to each other with regard to their military conflicts, they do compete against each other in the domain of trade and technology. Interestingly, at the same time, both the countries also cooperate on certain global issues. So these unique and different dimensions can be seen in the American policy towards China, and hence it is adopting a combination of tough and moderate approach. Plus, these visits also represent the evolution of American Indo-Pacific policy that is centered on building its alliances with close partners like Japan, South Korea, Australia, etc. It also highlights America's pursuit of close partnerships with countries that have an independent policy such as India, Mongolia, Vietnam, and Singapore. So, this ongoing realignment of American policy towards the Indo Pacific highlights its intention to take up the leadership role in the region to counter Chinese aggression. And as this geopolitical rivalry escalates between US and China, it presents numerous opportunities and as well as challenges for countries like India which have a different set of priorities in the Indo Pacific. Yes, we do have a convergence of interest with the US, but at the same time, our interests are not completely aligned with the US. So, as India's own complex relationship with China evolves, it would be very important for India to read the signs that are emanating from the US and anticipate the changes in American policy towards the Indo Pacific, as it is going to have a direct bearing on India's ties with China. Now, let's take up a column from page number 7, which deals with the topic of vertical reservation and horizontal reservation. And after explaining this, the writers go on to make a case for such horizontal reservation for women and transgender persons. See, vertical reservation refers to the reservation provided to communities and categories such as scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, other backward classes, economically weaker sections, etc. This reservation applies separately for each of the groups as specified under the law. An example includes reservation provided under Article 16 Clause 4 that provides an exemption for backward classes and allows the government to violate right to equality of opportunity in matters of public employment. So when an entirely separate category of reservation is provided, we refer to it as vertical reservation. Such vertical reservation has been provided for these categories in both education and as well as in government jobs. Now, for example, let's say there are 100 seats in a particular college. Then if vertical reservation is applied to these 100 seats, then roughly 15% of those seats will go to the SC category, around 7.5% of the seats will go to the ST category, and so on and so forth. So essentially, vertical reservation applies separately for each category. Whereas horizontal reservation, on the other hand, refers to equal opportunity provided to other categories of beneficiaries, such as women, veterans of the armed forces, transgender persons, persons with disabilities, etc. The best example for this would be provisions contained under Article 15, Clause 3. This fundamental right provides an exemption to be made for women and children and allows the state to make special provisions for them, and it is one of the reasonable restrictions under Article 15. This horizontal reservation does not apply separately on the overall number of seats. Instead, it is applied to each category of vertical reservation. Now, let's say, for example, 33% of the seats are reserved for women. Then this would be a form of horizontal reservation. Then 33% of the seats in each category will have to be filled by women. So horizontal quota or horizontal reservation is applied separately to each vertical category and not across the board. Now this topic is in news because Bihar has recently announced such a horizontal reservation by providing for 33% reservation for women in higher education. This horizontal reservation was recently introduced by the Bihar government, through which 33% horizontal reservation will apply for women in the state engineering and medical colleges. The writers appreciate the Bihar government and its reservation model as it will help in promoting gender equality and promoting women empowerment. They argue that Bihar is leading the way in this regard and they are calling upon other states and as well as the center to follow the Bihar model. The writers argue that such horizontal reservation for women and as well as for transgender persons has become absolutely essential due to their very low participation rate in the workforce. If you look at the FLFP rate, that is the female labor force participation rate, it is extremely low at the national level and it is also very low at the level of the states as well. If you look at World Bank's data, it shows that India's female labor force participation rate declined to 21% in 2019 from 31.79% in 2005. Even if you look at the state of Bihar separately, the state's economic survey shows that female labor force participation rate has fallen drastically and only 6.4% of the women in urban areas and just 3.9% of the women in rural areas find employment. Even at the national level, the labor force participation rate for women in urban and rural areas is very low. These figures stand at 20.4% and 24.6% respectively for the urban and rural areas. See, women face very stiff barriers while they try to take part in the labor force. A majority of women are employed in unpaid work within their homes and family businesses. And particularly in the rural areas, majority of the women are employed in unpaid agricultural work. Then upon this, they face several social barriers, including gender-based discrimination and caste-based discrimination while they are seeking to join the workforce. This systematic gender discrimination with regard to women's education and women's employment is a result of patriarchal control of women in the society, and government intervention alone cannot defeat this trend. If this trend has to be reversed, and if gender disparity in education and employment has to be ended, what we need is a set of well designed government welfare schemes, along with the provision of horizontal reservation, just like the government of Bihar has provided in education and as well as in government jobs. The writers say that Bihar has always been leading the way in this regard in order to counter gender disparity or gender inequality and to promote women empowerment. Back in 1992 itself, Bihar introduced menstrual leaves every month for menstruating women, and in 2006, this was followed up by the introduction of 50% reservation in Panchayati Raj institutions, which made Bihar the first state to do so. See, under the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Acts, only one-third reservation was envisioned for women in Panchayati Raj institutions. But Bihar became the first state to implement this, and it even went beyond this and provided for 50% reservation. This landmark decision of Bihar was immediately followed by other states as well, such as Madhya Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Chhattisgarh. Then recently in 2013, Bihar introduced 50% reservation in cooperative societies for women, and another 35% horizontal reservation was introduced in police recruitment. As a result, the number of women police officers in Bihar police has jumped significantly, which until 2015 stood at just 3.3%. As of 2020, the number of women officers in Bihar police has jumped to 25.3%. This is double the national average of 10.3%. So the participation of women in the Bihar police force has been raised significantly through the introduction of such horizontal reservation. In 2016, the Bihar government extended this horizontal reservation to all government jobs where direct recruitment was being carried out. And now it has decided to introduce 33% horizontal reservation for women in higher education while seeking admission to state engineering and medical colleges. So such affirmative action led by the state, along with well-designed government schemes and programs, can truly promote women empowerment and end gender inequality. Again, in this regard, Bihar has been leading the way through schemes such as Mukhyamantri Balika Cycle Yojana, under which Class 9 and Class 10 girl students are provided with bicycles, and this led to a direct increase in enrollment of girl students in schools. It also played a key role in retaining girl students within the schooling system, thereby improving female literacy levels. Then Bihar even introduced a conditional incentive scheme known as Mukhyamantri Kanya Uttan Yojana, under which girl students are provided with 50,000 rupees in installments, which has been made conditional on the completion of their education, and another installment would be paid if they marry after a certain prescribed age limit. So through such well-designed targeted intervention programs, accompanied with affirmative action in the form of horizontal reservation in education and jobs, has helped Bihar to improve its female labor force participation rate, thereby leading to empowerment of women. So based on this success that Bihar has registered, the writers are calling upon other state governments and as well as the center to implement similar horizontal reservation, especially for women and as well as for transgender persons, in the domain of higher education and government employment opportunities. Next, according to this article on page number 9, the Supreme Court has held that the governor's pardoning powers overrides Section 433A of the Code of Criminal Procedure. See, the Constitution of India grants pardoning powers to the governor under Article 161. But these pardoning powers of the governor ran into a conflict with Section 433A of the CRPC. This section of the Code of Criminal Procedure mandates that a prisoner's sentence can be remitted only after the convict has served 14 years in jail. So this led to a constitutional question as to whether the governor can pardon a prisoner, including those on death row, even before they have served a minimum 14 years of prison sentence. See, we know that, unlike the president, the governor cannot entirely pardon a death sentence. Similar to governor's pardoning powers under Article 72, the president has also been given pardoning powers, but with a much wider ambit. Because the president can pardon a sentence of the convict given by court martial or by a military court, and he can even entirely pardon a death sentence through commutation or in its entirety. So while the governor cannot pardon court martial sentences, and while he cannot entirely pardon death sentences, he can definitely suspend or remit death sentences through these pardoning powers. But the pardoning powers of the governor and the president had run into a legal conflict with Section 433A of the CRPC, and the Supreme Court has clearly held that the governor's pardoning powers and as well as the president's pardoning powers under Article 72, they clearly override Section 433A of the CRPC. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: examine the evolving American strategy in the Indo Pacific. How does it impact Indian interests? The second question: illustrate the differences between horizontal and vertical reservation while making a case for reservations for women and transgender persons in government jobs and education. Kindly write your answers and post them on the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be shared in the description box below. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.